Delegates from Ukraine and Russia met Thursday in Belarus for a second round of direct negotiations. A Ukrainian official who took part in the talks says the two sides have tentatively agreed to a ceasefire in some areas of Ukraine. Those locations would be considered safe corridors for civilians to evacuate. The ceasefire would also allow for humanitarian supplies to be delivered. This all comes as Ukrainian officials say more than 2,000 civilians have been killed as Russia continues its attacks on populated areas across the country. For more, I want to bring in former CIA operative Lindsay Moran. Lindsay, thank you for joining us. Russia claims to have captured the port city of Kherson, as we've mentioned. A Ukrainian official also told CBS News that Russian troops are reportedly surrounding Mariupol, another major port along the Black Sea. What may be behind this strategy of targeting port cities rather than critical urban centers like Kyiv and Kharkiv?
Well, I mean, to be clear, Russia is also targeting major cities like Kiev and Kharkiv that have withstood brutal bombing. In Kharkiv, in particular, has been a case study of awful cruelty, with the central square being bombed and residential areas, and people there have lost everything. Another city, Chernaya, where Ukrainians are still holding strong. There was bombing in residential areas, and we're talking close to schools. Close to a children's hospital. I received videos today from environmental inspectors who are just taking videos from their homes, and it's absolute awful carnage. But to your point, this doesn't really suggest a shift in strategy as they go after port cities. I mean, on the one hand, it's rather obvious why port cities are so important to Russia and to Putin. But I think what it shows is that Putin is really trying to extend control over the southern coast, and also he needs a win. I think psychologically, Putin is obviously in a very impaired space, impaired place, but I don't think that Putin ever anticipated the resistance and the resilience of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian leadership within the cities. So it's not that he's changing tactics, but he's going after these other cities near and around the Black Sea. They're strategically very important, but also symbolically for him to have a win there is very important.
It is remarkable to see so many civilians taking up arms. Of course, that coast critical in so many ways. Two countries, I want to mention two countries who have notably not condemned Russia are China and Mexico. Why might that be?
Yeah, this is really troubling, particularly in the case of China. Intelligence reports suggest that Putin actually delayed military action until after the Olympics at the behest of the Chinese president. They had a meeting in February, and shortly thereafter, Moscow and Beijing issued a joint statement saying that there were no limits to their partnership and actually condemning NATO expansion. Well, we know that Putin has used the threat of NATO expansion as a justification for his brutal and unprecedented invasion of Ukraine. So the fact that China is not condemning Russia, not imposing sanctions, de facto kind of condoned the invasion of Ukraine by sort of politely asking that it be put off until after the Olympics. And I say that completely sarcastically. All indications point to a burgeoning alliance between China and Russia. And that is very troubling, not only for Ukraine, for the West, for the entire world.
We've learned the U.S. just announced more sanctions against Russian oligarchs in Putin's inner circle. How might the CIA be able to help Ukraine behind the scenes?
Well, there are a number of ways in which U.S. intelligence can and will certainly help Ukraine behind the scenes. Certainly supporting Ukrainian resistance with both battlefield and strategic intelligence is one thing that we can do. I think of the utmost importance is probably providing weaponry, providing anti-aircraft weaponry that could protect Ukrainians from bombardment from the Russians. Training Ukrainians in paramilitary operations and irregular warfare. We've been doing that for a while anyway. but certainly we would need to ramp up those efforts. The CIA, of course, does have paramilitary capabilities, which could potentially be involved. But you mentioned the oligarchs and sanctions against the oligarchs, and in my mind, there's only so much that can do. And what I think, not just U.S. intelligence, but all Western intelligence has to be looking at are there forces within Russia and within Putin's inner circle who might be able to dissuade him from his actions, or who might be able to do something about Putin being in power. And I say that because I think beyond looking at imposing sanctions, we have to be thinking about, are there within the Russian security forces and intel forces, will there be enough pressure within Russia or from the West that they could get Putin to change course or depose Putin?
And finally, Lindsay, I'm told you've been speaking to some people on the ground in Ukraine, including a government official and a man living in a shelter with his family near Kyiv. What have they been experiencing, and what do you think they want the world to know?
Sure. I've been in touch almost every day with Roman Shakhmatenko, and he's the Deputy Minister of Environmental Protection of Ukraine. And he has actually spoken to the UN and asked urgently that other countries and the West stop buying fossil fuels from Russia and stop fueling this maniacal tyrant. But I've been speaking to him. He's in a shelter in Kiev. And one thing that he really wants the world to know is that Ukrainians are not in despair. He described Ukrainians as proper strong and united as never before. And he even told me today that people from different political parties who hated each other before, wouldn't even shake hands, today we're all engaged in territorial defense. He even joked with me that Russia is bombing the television towers in Kiev, and he said, "We don't care. We're not watching TV." They're united in trying to defend their city and defend their country. I do hear from Roman that, and I hear from every source in the Ukraine, that the one thing they want desperately is for the skies to be closed. They feel that is the only way that Ukraine can ever prevail in this war against Russia, or this aggression from Russia. I've also spoken to a man named Denis in Bucha, and he is living under siege in Bucha, as many people there are, including women and children. And this guy is angry. He was displaced from Lugansk, where he was originally from, in 2014 when the Russians invaded. And he's just sick of this. And he told me, this is terrible situation where there are people, women and children, hunkered in basements, people who are not used to war, who are suddenly sheltering in basements. And they're trapped there. They're ostensibly trapped there. He said that the Russians are spreading disinformation, that green corridors are safe. And yet he knows that people who have tried to use these green corridors to escape the area have been shot and killed. And that there's also disinformation. The Russians will say, well, you can go to this railroad station and it's safe. And half an hour later, he finds out that the Russians have bombed this railroad station. It's an incredibly precarious and frightening situation for everyone there.
Frightening indeed to watch, but also remarkable to see the unity and the courage among the Ukrainians there. Lindsay Moran, thank you so much for your insight and your time.
Thanks for having me.